Well, good morning. This week, I have been with a group of pastors and church leaders from around New Zealand. And as we introduced ourselves, I was really impressed with one leader who spoke about his church community as a circle of compassion. And the way he phrased it was, who is outside the circle of compassion that needs to be inside? Who needs to be included in the circle? Who needs to be inside the circle? And I love the image that that conveys of us as the church joined together in a circle of compassion. Compassion for each other and compassion for others who may not yet be in our circle. Who are those who need our care and our love? Who needs to be in the centre of our circle, being nurtured, being cared for by the whole community? And how are we caring for those in the circle? Not just the ones that might be immediately to our right and left, not just the ones that we can see across the circle, but everyone in the circle. See, so often we think of church in rows. We think it's so easy when we're in rows to ignore people who might be on the other side, or who might be in a different row, or who don't sit near us in church. And it's easy to miss people or ignore them. But if everyone's in a circle, the circle of compassion, how do we show the love and care to each other? Is it as simple as a smile? Or saying hello to someone? Or including someone in an offer that we didn't perhaps think of, maybe coffee or lunch, or inviting someone we hadn't thought of inviting before. And then, are we able to ask ourselves, who wants to join the circle and be a part of this community? What is there to see here? Do people see compassion? Do they see love? Do they want to come and join that circle of compassion? Do they desire to be included and known? Would they be then impelled to go out and include others and draw others in so that they could also be shown that love that's been demonstrated to them? Now today, we are wrapping up this series on discipleship, and we are talking about communicating the gospel as part of who we are as disciples. And so I'd like to review now quickly what we have covered in the last 3 weeks. So in the first week, if you remember, we looked at how Jesus called his first disciples, and he continues to call us to be his followers. And we looked at how true discipleship demands absolutely everything of us, and how it calls us into complete submission, but it invites us also into this transformational relationship with Jesus. And I got you to think about your own story. And if you remember, I got you to think about, when did you first feel or sense the presence of God in your life? And how did you respond to that? And we talked about that with each other. And then I asked you to write down your story, where God has worked in your life over time, or where you're at today. And then the next week we looked at how we connect with each other and how we disciple each other as a community by walking together, whether that's mentoring or encouraging each other, or one-on-one, or in home groups. We're in this all together. And then we looked at the things that we can do to cultivate that transformational relationship, the practices that we have as a church and as individuals that put us in the place for God to transform us, the disciplines, the habits that help us, that open us to the Holy Spirit and to his work in our lives, enables us to see God in the details. So today, we are looking at how we communicate that relationship to others. This is the go of our series, Grow to Go, because all the other parts have really been looking at how we grow as disciples. We're called to be disciples, but we're also called to make disciples. So Matthew 28:19-20 says, "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all the things that I have commanded you, and lo, I'm with you always to the very end of the age." And these two things, grow and go, are very much interconnected. As Mark pointed out last week, we could just as easily have called this series Go to Grow, because you will know, if you've ever taught anything or coached anyone, you know how much you learn in that process of teaching someone else. So when we tell others about Christ, when we lead or teach or draw others to him, we develop as disciples. We develop as followers. And so it encourages us to see others come to Christ. And most of us think that this would be an integral part of our faith, to share the gospel. So this is from Barna Research in 2019. They concluded almost all practicing Christians believe that part of their faith means being a witness about Jesus, ranging from 95 to 97% of practicing Christians believe that across all generational groups, and that the best thing that could ever happen to someone is for them to know Jesus. 94 to 97% of practicing Christians believe that. In fact, out of that group, millennials feel the most comfortable and most equipped and confident in how to respond and share their faith, 86 to 73%. Despite that, many millennials are unsure about the actual practice of evangelism. So, almost half of millennials, 47%, agree at least somewhat that it is wrong to share one's personal beliefs with someone of a different faith in the hopes that they will one day share the same faith. And that would tie in with the view that to disagree with someone is to judge someone or be judged by them. And 65% of millennials believe that people are likely to take offence if they share their faith. And society, in a way, has shifted from that just accepting someone's different view to actually feeling threatened by someone's different view. But I don't think that that's just millennials, or that this is just a recent thing, because the stats have always been quite different between what we believe we should share our faith and actually sharing our faith. It's something that many of us seem to find difficult to do. So when I talked about that circle of compassion a few minutes ago, think back to how did you imagine that circle? Did you imagine everyone facing inward or outward? Now, I know you imagined it inward because I told you to look across the circle. But imagine if that circle actually faced outwards. If we as a church were actually oriented to people outside our immediate circle. If we seriously thought that we exist for the benefit of people who are not in the room, what would have to change if we took that thought seriously? We could pause for discussion here, but I actually think that's an entirely another sermon, possibly another series. So we might just park that there and think about that. But that is something that we need to think about. See, evangelism or sharing our faith is sometimes difficult to think about on a personal level. We're quite happy to think about it generally. The church community of LRBC here has been incredibly missional over many, many years. We, particularly through overseas missions, we support people with money, with prayers. We have mission services like we had last week. We can't wait for Lauren and Janai to get on board at Henderson High. We're happy that other people are doing mission, or that we're doing it generally. We leave it to the evangelists among us, perhaps. But what is it that makes us hesitant or resistant in some way to sharing our faith personally? Now, I may be a very bad example of a Christian, and you're all out there sharing your faith on the daily, but I remember when I was at high school hating being known as a Christian. And it felt like there was always this pressure to sort of evangelize, that I should be telling others about Christ, and that if I didn't, I was letting God down in some way. And that if I was ashamed of him, he would be ashamed of me, like we read in Luke 9. And I remember thinking, I can't wait to leave school, and I'm not going to tell anyone I'm a Christian ever again. And then I won't be judged, and I won't feel like I have to tell people about Jesus. That is how I left high school. Now, while I'm sure some of that was teenage angst, and maybe a major part of that was a really immature understanding of my faith, that feeling, that pressure to constantly tell others what I believed, I think contributed in part to me walking away from the church. And also my own stubborn willfulness, of course. But what I find interesting about this is that when I returned to church some years later, it was to a Reformed church where I heard, again, in my limited understanding, I heard this from the pulpit, that the church as a whole evangelizes the world, and therefore it wasn't really the responsibility of us as individuals to go out and sell Jesus to the world. And of course, this is a massive oversimplification for simplification of the doctrine of predestination. But this is why theology is important, right? So if you thought it wasn't important, now you know. It's worth studying. This is where it hits the road. But I remember sitting in that church and in the back of my brain thinking, I'm not 100% sure that I actually believe that, but you know what? Right now, I'm just going to take that, because I needed to sit there in that church's circle of compassion and heave a sigh of relief. That was what I needed to be nurtured by their love and their healing. I mean, they really did try. were married when we were at that church, and for our pre-marriage prep, we went through the entire Reformed Catechism. Just an idea, if anyone's wanting, you know. But if I'd sat there and they had beaten me over the head with the need to hit the streets and tell people about Jesus, I might have just hit the streets and walked out forever. So the question is, do we share our faith as the church, as a whole, or is it up to us as individuals? And I think the answer is both and. Because we as the church are God's witness in the world. We've talked quite a lot about being Jesus' hands and feet to others. But we're also his mouthpiece. For people who don't read the Bible, who are not going to come into church, they don't want to, they don't have access to it, the only way they are going to know about Jesus is if we actually verbalize it. So there comes a point where the mowing the lawns and the giving the cup of water and the sharing the meals becomes a conversation. And they may or they may not be like Zacchaeus in the story we read earlier. They may recognize their need and be curious or not. See, Zacchaeus was so desperately curious to see Jesus that he climbed a tree to get to him. And Jesus describes him in this passage as lost. Verses 9 to 10. Jesus said to him, "Today, salvation has come to this house because he's also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which was lost." See, Zacchaeus had lost his way. He had forgotten he was actually an Israelite. He had lost his way with wealth and the power that came with that wealth. He had lost his sense of identity by working with the Romans. He was hated, rejected by his own people, but he had lost who he was and who he was meant to be. But he was still curious in his lostness. While he might not have had a felt need, we might say, he was definitely curious. He was desperate to know what it was that Jesus was offering. Had he got to that point when he realized his life and the wealth was not giving him everything he wanted? Well, we don't really know, but his response to Jesus would certainly indicate it. There was this instant surrender and a giving up of everything that had gone before that might get in the way of him following Jesus. So meeting Jesus enabled him to become who he was meant to be. But what we sometimes miss here when we read things like this is that Zacchaeus had this direct encounter with Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus, and he did. And it changed his life completely. And what we sometimes struggle with is that thinking that in sharing our faith with people is that somehow we are responsible for the result. We are not. God is. It's Jesus that brought the transformation in Zacchaeus' life. And it's Jesus that brings transformation in people's lives. We think we have to have all the answers. We think we have to have all our theology ducks in a row. We do not, because it's God that brings that. And we can have an imperfect story and an unformed theology, but we have the story of what God has done in our lives for each one of us and what he continues to do today. We can certainly pray for people. We have so many people in our society around us who are like Zacchaeus. They are lost. They are lost in wealth. They are lost in their jobs. They are lost in whatever they are doing. They have lost their sense of direction about who they are meant to be, who they were created to be, and where they belong. They're not necessarily evil or bad or immoral people. They are just lost. And they have no sense of direction or knowing who they're meant to be. We have people who are so lost that they are pursuing caricatures, cartoon-like cutouts of what it is to be human, because they really don't understand what real humanity looks like anymore. And these people are all around us. Some of them will never visit a church, but they will talk to you, and they will look at your life. And others are curious, like Zacchaeus, and they want to see Jesus. Maybe they wouldn't climb a metaphorical tree, but they would like to know who Jesus actually is and what he offers. And sometimes their responses can surprise us. When I walked into that church years ago, I was lost. I was pursuing all my own selfish desires at the time. I was doing all the things I wanted to do, and I was not caring one little bit about what God wanted me to do. And we are all naturally like this. We all want to do what we want to do. And the Bible puts it this way in Isaiah 53:6, all of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's paths to follow our own. Yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all, or the iniquity, or the bad stuff, got taken and forgiven by Jesus at the cross. And it's only after we recognize our lostness and our inability to fix ourselves that we're able to surrender, to give everything to Jesus, like Zacchaeus did. It's only when we recognize the utter depths of depravity that we are capable of. And then we recognize that God knows that about you, he knows that about me, and he loves you anyway. That we can then surrender to him. It's only when we recognize who God is that he rose from the dead in Jesus. And we realize that he's able to forgive us and give us life to the full. We can stop judging others. We can stop judging ourselves and accept that forgiveness, accept his resurrection, and fully surrender to him. It's then that he gives us life to the full, like he promises in John 10:10, I have come that they may have life and life to the full. This is a quote from Eugene Peterson, and it's Karl Barth quoting Nietzsche. Only where graves are, there is resurrection. Is there resurrection? We practice our death by giving up our will to live on our own terms. Only in that relinquishment or renunciation are we able to practice resurrection. And it's interesting how much that statement is actually a part of life. It's not just a part of a life of faith, it's a part of all life. Because if you've ever experienced difficulty or pain or suffering in your life, there comes a point where you have to lay that down. You have to surrender that to God to be able to move on, to rise above it. And to rise again, something has to die. And when we follow Jesus, we follow in his death. We surrender ourselves to him, and we become truly who we were meant to be. This is discipleship. Now, a few weeks ago, as I said earlier, I got us to tell parts of our story to each other. What I'd really like to do now is for you to think about that story. I asked you to tell it in 2 minutes. Now, I've just told you part of my story. To be fair, I've taken a bit longer than 2 minutes. But I'd like you to think about your story and what God has done in your life. And I'd like you to think about who you know in your life that you could imagine telling that story to. And I'd like you to think of that person, one person, by name. Might be a friend, might be a neighbour, might be a relative. And what I'd like us to do now is to pray for those people who are on your heart. And so I'd like you to think of that person, those people, and then turn to the people in your row, in groups of 2s or 3s, and to pray for those people by name. Pray for an opportunity for a conversation. Pray for an opportunity to share your story. Pray for them to be curious about who Jesus is. And then when we've finished praying, we are going to watch a video to lead us into communion. It's a video of a presentation of the gospel using spoken word poetry, and I thought it would lead us nicely into communion, and then I'll pray and we'll come and take communion. So let's pray, because this is where it starts. Praying for the people who we love, who we desire. This is where God starts to work in people's lives, with prayer that we bring him for those who we love and care about. Pray that they will come and join the circle of compassion that is the church. So take a few minutes now